What exactly is the Dulce Base? Well, you could say it's the twisted parody of Area 51. You see, in Area 51, alien corpses are retrieved and then experimented on by humans. Over at the Dulce Base, however, it's the reverse. The aliens are the scientists, and us humans? Well, we're the test subjects. Tales from the Dulce Base describe trans-species experiments being carried out on thousands of humans held in cold storage in a 7-layered facility jointly run by multiple extraterrestrial races and the US government. If you've never heard of the Dulce Base, I guarantee you're not ready for the high strangeness you're about to hear. So, it's sometime around the mid-70s, the precise date unknown. Somewhere in the desert region of New Mexico, a state trooper named Gabriel Valdez is going about his normal routine, patrolling the area, when his attention is caught by a series of disturbing sights. Up in the sky, a strange but sophisticated craft flies overhead. But it's the sight on the ground that's even more unsettling. There, lying on the ground, is the mutilated corpse of a cow. And considering the high number of mutilated cattle reports going on around the region at this time, this sight is already disturbing enough. But Valdez is about to be startled by a lot worse. Inside the cow's mutilated body, Valdez sees a dead fetus. But this dead fetus looks nothing like an underdeveloped calf. Rather, it's a bizarre hybrid of organisms that somehow looks like a human, a monkey, and a frog. Now, let me just break the fourth wall quickly and say this. At this point, it's one of three things. 1. Valdez could just be telling a straight-up lie. 2. Valdez probably really did see what he claimed to see. However, he was also high as a kite at the time in question, so what he saw can't be taken seriously. 3. Valdez really did see a dead hybrid of a human, a monkey, and a frog in the womb of a dead cow. Obviously, option 3 sounds like the least possible answer. No one just wakes up and sees such things. But you know what they say about truth. It's often stranger than fiction, and few cases embody this saying as much as the case of the Dulce Base. So, back to Valdez. As he looks around this rather weird sight, he finds other disturbing pieces of debris close to the animal. There are glow sticks, gas masks, and some radar chaff. Whatever entity carried out this atrocity was definitely not a predator. Predators don't leave this kind of stuff behind. So, in Valdez's mind, these seem to be evidence of government involvement. A fact that Linda Moulton Howe would corroborate several years later in her 1980 Emmy-winning documentary, A Strange Harvest. Anyway, somehow after Valdez's strange experience, rumors simply circulate for a while. But then, there's no supporting story or anything, nothing to trace the strange sights back to. And so, the rumors ultimately die down. But then fast forward to a few years later, and several whistleblowers step onto the scene. One after the other, with each new testimony confirming the last, the eyewitnesses proceed to unravel the full story behind the case of the mutilated cow with the dead human monkey frog fetus in her womb. The horrors of this revelation still haven't been lived down even to this day. Here's what happened. In February 1954, President Dwight Eisenhower was on a golfing vacation at Palm Springs when he suddenly had to go see the dentist. You're probably wondering what a dental emergency has to do with an underground alien base, right? Well, here's what. Apparently, Eisenhower's dental visit happened at midnight. Not only that, his so-called dentist worked at the Edwards Air Force Base. Yeah, nobody bought that crap story either. So what was the truth then? Well, according to a former US Congress and Pentagon consultant, Timothy Good, Eisenhower had actually been spirited away to the remote New Mexico Air Base to participate in a secret meeting of aliens. A meeting that Eisenhower himself and other FBI officials had scheduled before the day of the so-called dental emergency. According to details of the encounter leaked by eyewitnesses of the meeting, Eisenhower met with two races of aliens at the meeting, the Nordics and the Gray aliens. But the meeting didn't end at merely exchanging pleasantries and talking about space weather. Apparently, Eisenhower also appeared to sign a kind of treaty with one of the alien groups, specifically the Gray aliens. Now, the terms of this pact were simple. The aliens would provide the government with advanced alien tech, and in return, the United States government would allow them to carry out experiments on both humans and animals alike. The United States immediately signed the treaty, which would later be called the Granada Treaty, leaving one to wonder why they conceded so easily. Did they really just not care for the citizens? Or did the aliens have something on them that left them no choice? Well, it was two things, really. First, the aliens particularly liked the United States because of the abundance of natural energy resources which they needed. Talking about rocks with electromagnetic properties, lightning, hurricanes, groundwater, extensive cave systems, and a beautiful atmosphere filled with ions. The second thing is the clincher, though. The aliens claim to be descendants of an ancient species of humanoid reptiles that had lived on Earth for thousands of years before humans showed up. In other words, if we were talking about rights, they had more rights to the land than we did, as they got here before us humans. So, put yourself in the government's shoes. First, you meet a delegation of aliens you could have sworn didn't exist up to that point. Then, these aliens say they want your land, citing their history with the land. Obviously, these species are more powerful than you and your kind, but for whatever reason, they are willing to be benevolent and offer you some of their tech, which, by the way, is the most advanced you have ever seen up to that point. Their only condition is that you leave them to do their business undisturbed. Keep in mind that you're in the middle of a Cold War, and the Soviet threat remains ever present. This is definitely not the time to refuse any help that can help you stay ahead. So, of course, Eisenhower agrees, and the so-called Granada Treaty is signed, which officially set the stage for the establishment of the very first underground base jointly run by humans and aliens, called the Dulce Base. And now, it's time for a guided tour. According to a whistleblower testimony, the Dulce Base is a massive 7-floor complex, each floor fitted with highly sophisticated security equipment that gets more advanced the lower you descend. Assuming you somehow get to visit the Dulce Base, when you enter, you'll be greeted by security personnel wearing coveralls that a pilot might wear. These guys are equipped with flash guns that are highly effective against humans and aliens alike. Before you get into the main interior of the facility, your identity would have to be confirmed using a retina reader. If you have clearance, you'll be allowed to descend to the second floor, where you'll be weighed naked, and then be given a white uniform since you're a visitor. From this point on, all sensitive parts of the facility are fitted with weight sensors and retina readers. So once again, don't do anything funny, because if any of these machines notice something different about you as you move around, an alarm will go off, alerting the guards, who will probably shoot you. Now, assuming you don't do anything funny to warrant your being escorted off the premises, as you walk around, you're going to find strange writings scrawled on different parts of the building. These are language symbols of the Gray and Nordic aliens. Another thing that will catch your attention is the level of technological advancement displayed through the infrastructure at the base. According to what we know, it was the aliens themselves who designed the facility and handpicked the construction materials used in building it. Many of the workers who put the materials together to construct the facility didn't even understand the technology they were working with. The elevators, for instance. Unlike our elevators that function with cables and all that, the ones at the Dulce Base do not use cables at all. Instead, they work with a magnetic system. Altogether, in the Dulce Base, there are over 3,000 security cameras, most of which are concentrated at the entrances, exits, and labs. And speaking of labs, this is where things start to get intense and horrifying. The labs at the Dulce Base are the stars of the show. This is where the aliens at Dulce conceive of and carry out the most grotesque forms of experiments on humans and animals for purposes we can only assume are diabolical. And just like we saw with security measures, these experiments get more nightmarish the lower you descend. The fourth floor is where you have the mind control and consciousness experiments, which involve your average manipulation of dreams, hypnosis, and telepathy. The fifth floor is also equally horrible, but not quite nerve-wracking yet. That's where the alien autopsies are carried out. The real Frankenstein kind of experiments, the kind that likely produced the human-monkey-frog hybrid fetus that Valdez found at the start of our conversation, well, those ones happen on the sixth level, fondly called Nightmare Hall, aka the worst floor of them all. There in the lab are hundreds, perhaps even thousands of tanks, each one filled with human and humanoid beings at different stages of development. As you look through the tanks, you see that many look confused and drugged. Others cry and beg you for help. The official story is that these people are hopeless psychiatric cases being tested with high-risk experimental drugs to see if there's any hope for their recovery. But, of course, that's a lie. Anyway, as it always goes in stories like this, all the workers at the Dulce Base facility are sworn to silence. They can never speak of anything they hear or see at this underground facility, a term that everyone initially accepts. Fast forward to 1979 though, and a huge conflict breaks out in the camp. On one hand are the aliens, and on the other are the humans. Before anyone realizes what's going on, the conflict evolves into a full-fledged war with violence, combat, and shootouts, ultimately leading to the death of 82 people, including scientists from the National Recon Group, who had been working with the aliens in the labs, and security agents from the Delta Group, who had been providing security for all human-alien collaborative projects at the site. This calamitous event has come to be known as the Dulce War, the day when aliens did what many have feared for years: slaughter humans like animals. The tales around this so-called Dulce Base are obviously quite tall. Frankenstein-style experiments on humans being performed by aliens, a war between humans and aliens where the aliens slaughter the humans. These sound like plot themes you'll find in a poorly made sci-fi movie. But here's the thing. We've got eyewitness testimony from not one, but several whistleblowers. In fact, we've got so much eyewitness testimony that it won't be possible to go over all of them in one video. That's why I'm going to be restricting the conversation to the top 3 eyewitnesses whose testimonies provide the best evidence for the existence of the Dulce Base: Paul Benowitz, Thomas Costello, and Phil Schneider. We will begin with Paul Benowitz. Around the time State Trooper Gabe Valdez stumbled on the mutilated cow that started this whole Dulce Base saga, a local Albuquerque businessman and electronics specialist named Paul Benowitz also became interested in the mutilated cow phenomenon. Benowitz had developed a keen interest in UFOlogy, as evidenced by his becoming a member of Arizona's Aerial Phenomena Research Organization, APRO, a civilian UFO investigation group. So, after the Valdez news broke, he immediately teamed up with the state trooper and began a series of field trips around New Mexico to investigate the mutilations. As the field trips progressed, Benowitz started to notice something strange. Around the New Mexico area, there seemed to be an unusually high frequency of UFO activity, strange craft flying that looked nothing like the regular jets everyone knew. Being an electronics specialist, Benowitz had access to photographic equipment. So Benowitz starts to film, and he's gathering hours and hours of evidence. But as fate would have it, at about the same time, his receivers also start to pick up on strange radio and video transmissions. These transmissions sound like comms between ships and a sort of underground base, which would have been totally inconsequential if the communications didn't sound like they were between groups of extraterrestrials. Curious, Benowitz tracks the source of these transmissions and discovers they're coming from the Archuleta Mesa area near Dulce. At the time, the Dulce base isn't exactly a thing yet, so Benowitz has no clue about any secret underground base where humans are being experimented on. All he knows is what his receivers are revealing to him. The whole thing sounds unbelievable at first, but I mean, this is hard, incontrovertible evidence. Benowitz can see the UFOs and hear the aliens themselves. This isn't mere theorizing or trying to fill in the gaps. Still, Benowitz knows that for people to believe him, he's going to have to build a strong, irrefutable case. So he takes his time and creates a communication system specifically for tracing these transmissions. And that's when the next set of strange findings come in. Initially, Benowitz's receivers were simply tracking radio comms between ET pilots flying to and from the Dulce base. However, with time, they also started to pick up on some extra frequencies. These particular frequencies were different in that they weren't radio comms. Instead, they seemed to be coming from some kind of chips, the kind you might implant in a person or your dog to keep track of their location. Naturally, Benowitz decided to trace these frequencies to find out what exactly these extraterrestrials were tracking. His findings led him to a certain woman, known as Mirna Hansen. No, not the super cute supermodel from the 50s, a different one whose picture I couldn't find. Anyway, it was revealed through Hansen that Benowitz finally realized the sick and twisted mess he had managed to get himself entangled in. You see, in 1980, shortly after Benowitz started his investigations, Mirna Hansen and her son were abducted by some strange beings. Or at least so she claimed. Unfortunately, but not surprisingly, that was all she could remember. What exactly happened to her and her son while in captivity, and how she returned home, she couldn't say. The only thing she knew for sure was that she was abducted. To make matters complicated, somehow, during his investigations, Benowitz had discovered that all the people with the tracking devices he'd been picking up on had the same story as Mirna Hansen. They were abducted by strange beings, but that was all they could remember. Wanting to get to the bottom of the matter, Benowitz got Hansen to go through hypnotic therapy in order to retrieve her memories. The session was conducted by a trained specialist, Dr. Leo Sprinkle, from the University of Wyoming, and the revelations were chilling. Under hypnosis, Hansen explained how she was abducted along with her son and taken inside the Dulce base. She also talked about how she encountered cold storage units containing whole human beings, as well as large vats filled with the body parts of both humans and cattle. Fitting all the pieces of the puzzle together, Benowitz began to come to a rather horrifying realization that the cattle mutilation, the alien abduction, the UFO activity, and the weird transmissions he had intercepted were all connected. Could there be an ET base over at Dulce? Is that the source of all the weird activity going on within the western region? The evidence seemed to suggest a very strong yes. So Benowitz immediately did what any patriotic citizen would do, and reported his findings to the Kirtland Air Force Base in October of 1980. His report contained the following key revelations. The location of an alien base in northern New Mexico, specifically at the center of the Jicarilla Apache Reservation, 4.5 miles northwest of Dulce. Details about a deal made with the aliens in this base many years ago that involved giving the land, cattle, and an assurance of safety to the aliens in exchange for alien tech in the form of an atomic-powered ship, while establishing an extensive U.S. base to said ship. Information about a certain argument over weapons that happened either in late 1979 or early 1980 that led to an abandonment of the Dulce base by the military, although the final condition of these men remains unknown. Other interesting bits of information were included in the report, but as you can see, these details already match everything we know about the Dulce base so far. In fact, the last point sounds like a backstory for the rumored Dulce War that took place and led to the death of many soldiers and scientists at the Dulce base. Obviously, these are chilling revelations, and it makes sense that Benowitz immediately tried to reach out to the authorities with what he had found. I wouldn't do that, and you probably wouldn't, but Benowitz did, and not surprisingly, this innocent move turned out to be the singular worst mistake Benowitz would ever make in his life. Benowitz's findings immediately started making waves, drawing the attention of both the general public and top government officials like the New Mexico Senator Harrison Schmitt. It was through Benowitz's Project Beta that the world got to know that there was an ET base over at Dulce that housed a huge population of aliens of different races. Also, based on the number of ships he had tracked going in and out of that area, Benowitz had guesstimated that there were probably at least 2,000 aliens over at this base, probably even more. However, just as quickly as Benowitz's findings started to make waves, they also immediately started getting discredited, as rumors started circulating that Benowitz had largely exaggerated the truth and made up a lot of the more egregious things he had reported. You've got to admit that believing that a group of aliens have a base in New Mexico where they abduct human beings and experiment on them to form human-monkey-frog hybrids stretches the limits of credulity. So it didn't take much for UFO researchers to be convinced that Benowitz's report was probably from his wild imagination. Then, in 1989, something happened that made people consider that Benowitz could be telling the truth. During an MUFON conference, famed UFO specialist turned community pariah, William Moore, dropped the bombshell about how he had been a part of the disinformation campaign organized by the AFOSI against Paul Benowitz to discredit his findings and protect some classified project the Air Force was working on. And this just about sealed Benowitz's fate. The general consensus in the UFO community at that time became that Benowitz was initially onto something, but that somehow he had fallen victim to the AFOSI's disinformation campaign. Fortunately, or unfortunately for Benowitz, at that point he had left the scene after suffering a mental breakdown in 1985 that saw him committed to an institution for a month. As a matter of fact, Benowitz's involvement in the Dulce base investigation did nothing but destroy him and his family. The AFOSI, after discovering he was onto something, stepped in and started to play with his mind, until Benowitz was driven to the point of insanity. This caused a strain in his marriage and destroyed everything Benowitz had worked hard to build. Just like that, the Dulce base rumors were once again put to bed. But then, again, another whistleblower came onto the scene, and this time, the AFOSI couldn't discredit him, because unlike Paul Benowitz, this one had worked in the Dulce base himself, and he came armed with hard proof. 2 years after the AFOSI successfully broke Benowitz's mind, a certain whistleblower by the name of Thomas Costello broke into public awareness with his release of what he called the Dulce Papers. This collection of documents contained 30 photos, a video, and a set of papers showing physical evidence of a joint government extraterrestrial base under the Archuleta Mesa near the town of Dulce in New Mexico. Now, I tried looking for the documents themselves, but couldn't find them anywhere on the internet. Only a short 5-page document that seems to be an abridged version of the main thing. I'll link to it in the description in case you want to check it out yourself. Anyway, the Dulce Papers proved to be Benowitz's vindication, as its content aligned with everything Benowitz had revealed several years prior, from accusations of a joint effort between the US government and multiple ET races to execute human rights violations at a scale never before seen in human history, to the storied Dulce Wars that resulted in the deaths of multiple US citizens. Costello's Dulce Papers also, for the first time, gave us insight into the aliens that occupy Dulce Base. According to Costello, there were 4 extraterrestrial races who worked at Dulce. There were the standard short grays from Zeta Reticulum, who stood at approximately 4 feet in height. Then, there were the tall grays from Rigel, Orion. These ones stood at 7 feet. The base also had 2 reptilian species. One was native to Earth and served as the working caste among the ETs. The other was from the Draco star system in Orion and typically supervised the Earth reptilians. Reptilians typically stood at 6 to 8 feet tall. Alright, so interesting information so far, but who exactly was the man behind the Dulce Papers? Thomas Costello? Well, from information gathered from interviews conducted by UFO researchers, Costello was a young sergeant, initially stationed at Nellis Air Force Base near Las Vegas, Nevada. There, Costello served as a military photographer with a top-secret clearance before he quit the force and started for RAND, the research organization. By the way, it's been alleged that RAND Corporation was involved in the construction of Dulce Base, studying the geology of the Dulce area before the actual construction began. Anyway, Costello's new job with RAND meant an upgrade in his clearance level, which ultimately translated into his being able to access the extensive surveillance systems at the Dulce Base. Costello also claimed that part of his responsibilities at the facility involved interacting with different ET species, as he basically helped to resolve all issues regarding video surveillance equipment and similar equipment, meaning that if the ETs had any issue with the security cameras, they reached out to Costello. As a result, Costello was in the know of some of the horrifying trans-species genetic experiments being carried out in Nightmare Hall and Level 7. In his interviews, Costello mentioned seeing row after row of thousands of humans and human mixtures in cold storage. During his initial briefing, Costello had been informed that the humans he was seeing were psychiatric patients being treated for their severe insanity with some experimental drugs. He was also warned to never speak to any of the patients, as it could destroy years of hard work. So, like a good team player, he cooperated until he began to develop some suspicions that these people were probably not insane. And it all began when a certain man who called himself George S. reached out to him. Writing about Level 7 of the Dulce Base facility, Costello mentioned that he frequently encountered humans in cages. Most times these people were dazed or drugged, but sometimes they cried and begged for help. Initially, Costello had believed the official narrative, and so he didn't speak to them as the rules stated. However, one day, one of the alleged patients, George S., reached out to him, and for some reason, Costello just felt the urge to hear this man out. George S. then proceeded to narrate to Costello how he had been kidnapped, and how he was sure someone was definitely searching for him. Once again, for reasons he couldn't explain, Costello found that he couldn't take his mind off of George S.'s story. So he reached out to a cop friend and asked for a background check to be run on this George S. Lo and behold, when his cop friend came back with the information, he confirmed George S.'s story. George S. really was a missing person. The realization immediately hit Costello like a ton of bricks. These people who were all hanging in cold storage were not insane patients getting experimental treatment like his superiors had told him. These were abducted victims being subjected to grotesque experiments and being used as food for extraterrestrial beings. The whole affair proved too much for Costello, and he decided he was going to have to do something about it. Thus, once again, for the first time, we get insider front row access to the full story of how the Dulce War started. According to Costello's version of events, a small resistance group, of which he was a member, banded together to help fight off the extraterrestrials and release the trapped humans at the base. The resistance group even had some help from some reptilians in the worker caste, who also wanted to help free the abducted humans. Unfortunately for Costello and his resistance group, they were disadvantaged from the word go. None of the human workers in the group or the reptilian worker caste had access to any weapons, and so they were easily overpowered by the elite Delta Force who were fully armed. In Costello's words, it was a massacre. A lot of human workers lost their lives, along with some reptilian ETs. After the war, Costello quit the facility, but not before he managed to steal a bunch of photos and a video recording, which would eventually become the Dulce Papers. This takes us to the third major eyewitness we're going to be talking about today, Phil Schneider. Schneider's testimony and mysterious death provide the final evidence substantiating the Dulce Base rumors. In the history of UFO whistleblowing, perhaps one name that has managed to attain canonical status in certain corners is Phil Schneider. In 1995, Schneider gave a public lecture in which he exposed everything he knew about the Dulce Base and more. 6 months later, Schneider was found dead in his apartment. The official narrative was that Schneider had committed suicide. However, sources close to the investigation claimed that Schneider was actually found with either a catheter or piano wire wrapped around his neck, suggesting that this was a military-style execution and not a suicide as the official story claimed. Why did they call it a military-style execution? Well, to understand that, we have to go back to Schneider's September lecture and the damning revelations that he opened up that day. If you'd like to check out the lectures yourself, I'm going to leave links in the description for you to check out. But before I get to the revelations, a bit of background about Phil Schneider. Schneider was a geologist and an engineer who claimed to have worked on military black projects in the US for about 17 years. And now that you know that, let's do a sort of highlight reel of Schneider's revelations. So, according to Schneider, 1. As of 1995, there were 131 active deep underground military bases, some of which he was involved in constructing himself. 2. Each of these bases cost about $17 to $19 billion to build in 1995 money, which translates to $35 to $40 billion in today's money. The bases were also built in about 1 to 2 years. 3. Each of these bases also housed thousands of employees, many of which included alien life forms. 4. The DUMBs are spread all over the United States and are connected via magneto-levitation trains. These trains are capable of speeds up to Mach 2, which is twice the speed of sound or even higher. 5. The United States government signed a treaty with the ETs in 1954 called the Grenada Treaty, which allowed ETs to experiment on people and cattle in exchange for alien technology. This agreement also included the clause that the aliens could only abduct a small percentage of the population, and that abductees had to be returned where they were picked from, with their memories wiped clean. Which might explain why Mirna Hansen had no memory of her experience during her abduction. 6. There are 11 distinct alien races on Earth, and only 2 are benevolent, with the other 9 viewing humans as a food source. 7. There was a war at the Dulce Base that resulted in a massacre of scientists and military personnel. It was in that war that he lost his fingers, as you can see in the photo. So, you kinda see why people would make the assumption that it was a military assassination. And it's not just that. Schneider also claimed that he was attacked by an alleged FBI agent about 16 days before his public lecture, and then another 11 times after his lecture. Multiple times, Schneider also told his family that if he ever wound up dead, that they shouldn't believe the claims that he committed suicide. This seems to suggest that Schneider always suspected that his revelations would eventually get him killed, and it happened precisely as Schneider predicted, which you've got to admit, gives the guy some serious credibility. But, as always, there are some real objections put forward by skeptics that challenge the testimonies of Schneider and the other eyewitnesses. We'll get to these objections, but before then, in order to give these eyewitnesses the benefit of the doubt, I thought we could examine one particularly controversial claim they made, which involved the government and what evidence outside their testimony exists to back up such claims. Remember that each of the eyewitnesses claimed that the government had entered into a treaty with extraterrestrials, allowing for the receipt of alien tech in exchange for permission to experiment on humans. So, is there any external evidence to back up this claim? Well, Lieutenant Colonel Philip Corso, who served in the National Security Council under Eisenhower, says yes. When it comes to credible whistleblowers, there are only very few people who touch Lieutenant Colonel Philip Corso. Not only did he serve in Eisenhower's National Security Council, but Corso also served under General Patton in World War II. All of Corso's claims about his military background, the people to whom he reported, and the roles he played in the military, including serving as the head of the Pentagon's Foreign Technology Division, have all been independently verified by multiple sources. So, there's no question about it. Corso is, indeed, who he claims to be, which means that his claims aren't things you take lightly. And when it came to extraterrestrials and the US government, Corso definitely had a lot to say. For instance, in June of 1998, just a few weeks before his death, Corso swore under oath to seeing alien cadavers and handling alien tech recovered from the Roswell debris, which the government then seeded into the private tech industry to fast-track some of the innovations that would come to mark that time period, like fiber optics, integrated circuits, and lasers. To this day, skeptics have had their opinions about Corso's claims, but none has been able to successfully and completely debunk Corso's claims about what happened after Roswell. The truth remains that records publicly available place Corso in the precise places he would have had to be to see and handle all the things he claimed to see and handle. But you can go down that rabbit hole later. Let's get back to what Corso said about the Grenada Treaty. Though Corso never talked about the treaty directly, the late veteran did make a passing comment about it in his book. To quote him, "We had negotiated a kind of surrender with them," referring to the ETs, "as long as we couldn't fight them. They dictated the terms because they knew what we most feared was disclosure." Corso suggested that the Grenada Treaty was begrudgingly signed by the Eisenhower administration, but that the treaty brought about the benefit of technology transfer, while the ETs were allowed permission to harvest all kinds of genetic material from within the US. Corso even suggested that the genetic diversity of the United States was the reason that the ETs had chosen America, rather than the more racially homogeneous Russia or China. Yes, we might say that Corso tells a tall tale, and that his testimony reeks a bit of narcissism, which seems to be the bulk of the argument against Corso. But a number of things immediately come up for consideration, the primary one being why Corso would make up such lies. I mean, what's the incentive? Keep in mind that Corso made these claims as an 83-year-old man, after a long and decorated career. He'd worked with a US president and served under General Patton. With those kinds of achievements, he should have known that made-up stories about the government's involvement with aliens of all things would have meant the downfall of all that he had worked so hard to build all these years. It just doesn't make sense that Corso would take such a foolish risk so close to death. What makes more sense is that Corso really did experience the things he claimed, and then, being an old man and close to the grave with nothing to lose, he decided to tell his tales, knowing full well they'd be hard to believe. Now, all cards on the table, there are a few facts that do not line up with one another in Corso's testimony. But even at that, I still don't think it totally discredits Corso. That sort of thing happens even when someone is telling the truth. Sometimes you forget stuff, or you just use the wrong language. It's just the way it is. But hey, you let me know what you think. Meanwhile, I'll link to the original manuscript of Corso's book so that you can read it and come to your own conclusions. I'd advise you not to read the published version a day after Roswell, as it is a much more sensationalized version of what Corso actually wrote and takes too many liberties. It is said that Corso himself, who is known as a straight shooter, never liked the way the book was edited, and the final published work never had his blessing. So be sure to make your judgments only from Corso's manuscripts. Now, when you add all these together, Dulce Base is starting to look like an alien base for real. At least that's what most people think. But not everyone agrees with this. I mean, experiments, hybrids, and all that. Come on. And not only did they not believe these stories, but they also came with proof to show that these stories were all lies. Like you probably are thinking, I also think that the Dulce Base claims are a hoax. And this isn't even just me. Many UFO believers are also of this opinion. But hey, don't get me wrong, I do not think that this completely lets the US government off the hook when it comes to allegations about their knowledge of UFOs and aliens. In fact, if anything, looking into the Dulce Base mystery helped to reinforce that belief for me, but I'll get back to that in a bit. First, let me show you why I think the Dulce Base claims very likely aren't real, beginning with the fact that human beings are just not that good at keeping secrets. Think about it. For the Dulce Base to exist, you'd need literally thousands of people involved, from the construction of the base to the actual work being done in the facility. It strains credulity to think that the government put all of this together and somehow got every single person to cooperate and not leak the secret. Think about everything we know about the CIA's clandestine activities like MK Ultra, for instance. Or think about the Watergate scandal. We know these things because people cracked and spilled. How come we still don't exactly have tangible proof of this so-called Dulce Base even 70 years after, with the thousands of people involved? The closest tangible proof we have comes from Thomas Costello, whose identity no one can ascertain for sure, because he doesn't exist. Or let's say he doesn't exist on the grid. Whatever the case, the truth remains that there's no evidence for the existence of a Thomas Costello. Sympathizers say that he went off the grid and that his records were expunged from the public database. Well, that seems a little convenient. Besides, even if we knew who he was, we also have the fact that the evidence Thomas Costello presented turned out to be faked. Let's go back to this image that the so-called Costello included in his Dulce Papers. By the way, we still don't know how the Dulce Papers got out. The story is that Costello put copies of the document in the hands of some researchers. But we don't know who these researchers are. No one has ever claimed that they received the Dulce Papers from Costello, so we don't know much about the origin of the so-called Dulce Papers either. Alright, back to our game of Spot the Difference. Look at this picture from a scene of an Arnold Schwarzenegger movie, The Sixth Day. Now go ahead and spot the difference. I don't know about you, but they look exactly the same to me with nothing changed. So even if we could identify Costello, this already serves as a serious strike against him, since it appears that he fudged his evidence. Another issue I noticed was the wide disparity in the recounting of the Dulce Wars among all the people who claimed to be eyewitnesses. Costello claimed that he had tried to form a resistance group to help free the abducted humans, and that was what resulted in the war. Another alleged whistleblower, Dr. Michael Wolff, who claimed to have been a former scientist and policymaker on ET affairs with the US government, placed the war on a wrong date altogether, and says that the fight broke out over an issue with weapons testing. Then there was Phil Schneider, who said he had gone into the base to check out the rocks so he could advise the government contractors assigned to build another base on top of the current one on what explosives they should use. In Schneider's version, he goes down to the base when he meets a group of aliens. He immediately fires his gun at one of them. Although why he has a gun as a geologist working on site beats me. After shooting at the alien, Schneider claims that a shootout ensues, which was how he lost 2 of his fingers. So, well, which is it? These are very different tales that are impossible to even string together. This is not a case of different people just telling it as they recall. This is a case of people reporting completely different events. Events I'm inclined to believe they didn't witness themselves, contrary to their claims. But just for fun, let's assume that the Dulce Wars actually did happen. Who were these guys who were killed? The death toll is placed at 82. It's safe to say that each of these 82 people had immediate and extended families. They had friends, colleagues, acquaintances, distant relatives. How come we don't have any reports from any of these people claiming that their loved one was mysteriously killed? Or did the aliens wipe them out too, or erase their memories? How exactly do you explain that? Which leads me back to Phil Schneider. Of all the eyewitnesses to the Dulce Base mystery, Schneider is probably the one with the least credibility. A lot of his claims, including claims about his own father being a Nazi U-boat captain, turned out to be false. Plus, it was discovered that Schneider was simply repackaging ideas about Dulce Base that were already in print, not that he had ever been there himself. Okay, but how do we explain his 2 missing fingers, you ask? Well, it turns out Schneider cut them off himself. FBI records confirm for us that Schneider was mentally disturbed. He was even admitted at the Dimash State Hospital in Oregon, where he got treatment for schizophrenia for a while. And according to one of the reports, Schneider would mutilate himself whenever he was stressed. It was probably due to mental stress that he amputated 2 of his fingers and 1 of his thumbs as well. In fact, we have information from the FBI that Schneider once removed 300 pounds of radioactive material and stored it under his bed until it was detected by the FBI and removed. That does not sound like the activity of a stable man, or at least a man who knows enough for his claims about an ET base to be taken seriously. So when he claims that the United States government signed a treaty with aliens, we should take that with a whole ocean of salt. Not just because of his credibility or the lack of it, but also because there's no tangible proof of such a thing happening. The Eisenhower alien treaty theory is pretty popular within the UFO community, and many have provided all kinds of proof from remote viewing results to testimony from Laura Eisenhower, Eisenhower's great-granddaughter, whom everyone knows by now, lies about many things. Perhaps the fastest way this claim unravels is when we ask ourselves why aliens would bother signing a secret treaty with the President of the United States. One thing that is consistently suggested in UFO lore is that aliens are far ahead of us intellectually. So, why would they sign a treaty that would have no legal authority in the real world? Because for the alleged Granada Treaty to have been valid, the president would have needed the advice and consent of 2/3 of the Senate, which would have meant that the treaty couldn't be kept secret, which obviously defeats the purpose. The aliens literally had zero incentive to enter into a treaty with the US government. They could literally just keep abducting whoever they want, because what's the government going to do about a race that was able to make its way from its planet to theirs? All of these reasons make me believe that the Dulce Base was a huge hoax. But as I said, the government isn't entirely off the hook yet. There's something else that needs to be explained. Sometime around the 1960s, the Dulce area was used by the US government as a site for a classified Atomic Energy Commission program called Gas Buggy. This program, in turn, was part of a larger operation called Plowshare. Apparently, there was this massive underground supply of natural gas that the US government wanted to access. So, the plan was to nuke the area with a huge atomic explosive deep underground. I mean, I'm not even a geologist, and even I know that this is a horrible idea. But on December 10th, 1967, the government went ahead and carried out their so obviously foolhardy plan, nuking an entire area over 4,000 feet below ground at the Carson National Forest, some miles away from Dulce. Obviously, the gas that was released was so radioactive it couldn't be used for anything. The land was also contaminated to the point of condemnation, resulting in the government placing a permanent ban on any excavation within the area. The obvious silliness of this nuclear fracking idea has made people question the true purpose of Project Gas Buggy and Operation Plowshare. Was it really to access natural gas, or was the government trying to blow up an underground alien base? Because here's something we can't explain away. Residents within the Dulce area stubbornly insist that there's something weird going on at Dulce, considering their daily experiences. Residents claim to see UFOs flying regularly over their airspace. Plus, let's not forget all the cattle mutilation reports that continue to defy explanation to this day. These experiences are not nothing. Something bizarre is definitely happening at Dulce. Despite not trusting the alleged whistleblowers, I don't think that means we can heave a sigh of relief just yet. Dulce obviously still holds a lot more mysteries that are yet to be unraveled. What if something unimaginably worse lies in wait?